From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power with David Weston.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Well, yesterday was all about those CPI numbers and the market reaction to those numbers. Today, there's a fair amount of aftermath of that as well, but we also have some new numbers in from the University of Michigan, those consumer sentiment things. So we're now going to look to Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent Michael McKee. So UMich came in maybe a little bit to the contrary of where CPI was yesterday.
Well, the good news story is interrupted here. It's a little hard to understand why, but in the first part of November, the University of Michigan's preliminary survey shows a big decline to 54.7 from 59.9. Analysts had thought they might drop a little bit to 59.5, but that's a big fall off. And not only that, but current conditions went down from 65.6 to 57.8 and expectations to 52.7 from 56.2. So all across the board, Americans now and in the future seem pessimistic. Hard to know exactly what caused that. But it's also interesting because this is right in the weeks leading up to the midterm elections. How did Democrats do so well? Well, here's a possibility. A lot of hot takes out there, but this is mine. Look at the middle number. I mean, we knew Democrats thought the economy was better than Republicans did, but independents, more than 50%, think the economy was good, 60.1% going in. The future numbers are much lower for independents, but going into this vote, they were reasonably happy about the state of the economy, which was the case that Joe Biden was trying to make, that unemployment was still low, employment was growing, and that growth was coming back. So maybe that had something to do with it. The other number that matters a lot, David, of course, is the inflation expectations numbers, which matter to the Fed and tie into that CPI, and they're not as good. They tick up a little bit, 5.1% on the 1 year and 3% on the 5 to 10 year inflation figures, and they're still reasonably high there. So they're not offering as much of a great picture as the CPI did, but maybe because, again, lagging.
Yeah, maybe lagging, and maybe part of the reason they're not as quite enthusiastic as they're worried about inflation. They're not quite as happy about that. Thank you so much to Michael McKee. He's Bloomberg economics editor. And to give it a perspective from a true economist on these numbers and what we should read into them, for that matter, what we should not, welcome now Paul Krugman. He's Distinguished Professor of Economics at the City University of New York and a recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. So, Dr. Krugman, thank you so much for being with us. What do you see in these CPI numbers?
Okay, so I mean, the number itself, monthly numbers, you look at even core inflation, which is supposed to be non-volatile, and the monthly number is volatile, and you really shouldn't read very much into that. A lot of us have been looking at 3-month rates of change as a kind of compromise. The year is too long, 3 months smooths it a bit, and the 3-month rate of change and CPI is a little bit down, but not really. There really isn't a lot of news. But what I think has happened here is that this good number gave people license to believe all the other news that is pointing towards a significant downward trend in inflation. So what happened was not so much that it was a really good number as the fact that it was a kind of we've had repeatedly, I certainly have had repeatedly, disappointments where you thought there was good stuff happening and then you get a number that really kind of punctures that, and this number did not. And so you can look behind it to the underlying factors that give you reason to believe that inflation really is coming down.
So, Paul, among other things, you're known for those columns in the New York Times. You wrote one recently about the lagging effects. And what I took from that column was there's a fair amount of lag, not just inflation going up, but in coming down. There are some things out there that should be kicking in the coming months.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that is really standing out now is the CPI is not really designed as a gauge of macroeconomic conditions. It's designed to measure the cost of living. And a really big component of it, really 40% of core inflation, is shelter, which is rents. But even if you own your own house, the BLS imputes a rent, which is basically based on what people are paying for apartments. And that is a number that does not reflect current market conditions because people have leases. And so if there are big changes in the rental market, if new tenants are seeing big changes in their rents. That only filters through quite gradually. The BLS did a study which said that they're basically their overall rent index seems to lag market rents by about a year. And right now, shelter is driving this inflation. Essentially, all of the core inflation in the last month was shelter. A very large part of it, over even 3 months, is shelter. And yet we know that that's reflecting what was going on in rental markets, 6, 12, maybe even more months ago. And that's a huge, and we also know we don't have great official data, but we have plenty of, my apartment list, Zillow, et cetera, and just plain anecdotal evidence that says that basically rental markets have rolled over, that rental inflation has dropped to pre-pandemic levels, maybe even below that. So the number you see for inflation is in many ways a portrait of where the economy was last winter, not a portrait of where the economy is now. And where the economy is now is probably a lot more favorable.
So, Professor Krugman, one of the reasons what you do is so difficult, at least from my point of view, is you can pick things out and you're not exactly sure which ones stay and which ones don't. We talked to a friend and colleague of yours, Larry Summers, earlier today, and he was concerned maybe we're being selective in how we're looking at inflation. This is part of what he had to say.
And there were a lot of special factors in these numbers, some of which will be reversed. Particular, as always, Team Transitory only focuses on the things that are likely to come down in the future, not the things that are likely to go up in the future. I don't think apparel prices will keep going down so fast. I don't think we've really got structural disinflation in medical care.
So, Professor, for those of us who are not professionals like you and Larry Summers, how do we make sense out of this?
Oh, I actually agree. I mean, we have historically, you did really well with a very simple thing, just exclude food and energy, which we knew were volatile. Now, in this kind of crazy post-pandemic era, lots of things have turned out to be volatile, and there is a real risk that I would say it applies to the inflation hawks as well as the inflation doves of, picking and choosing which things to include, which things to exclude to support your narrative. I have largely given up, personally, on using the CPI to judge what's going on at all. I mean, I try to understand what's happening, but for the most part, I've been focusing on something which I think is a little less sensitive to this kind, less of a temptation to engage in motivated reasoning, which is to look at wages. And the wage numbers are showing a pretty clear trend downwards in inflation. That's kind of my bottom line. But Larry is right. You really do not want to start. If you keep on inventing new indices that tell the story that you like, then you're going to be in trouble. And also, if you start throwing out more than half the CPI, as some of these indices do, then you're in trouble. So, you really just need to, but you do need to understand. I mean, there are things like, as he says, medical care, pharma. There are a lot of things in there that are dubious. I think the big story about rents, about shelter prices, vastly overstating. A year ago, they were understating true inflation. Now that they're really overstating it, I think that one is pretty solid. That's not a pick and choose issue.
So, Professor, as you know, we really focus on this in part because of what we anticipate it might mean for the Federal Reserve. So let me make it even harder and ask you to say how you think the Federal Reserve should or could react to the numbers they're getting. And to be very specific, how far up do we need to go? And at what point do we start coming down again when it comes to interest rates?
Okay, my view, but it's not going to matter for the Fed is not going to do this. My view is that the Fed has probably done enough already. And that they really should pause and wait to see. But that would amount to, in practice, a major loosening because markets would be surprised and longer-term interest rates would come down and all that. So what they're actually going to do is, I don't know. I'm not a Fed criminologist. I can't tell you what exactly they're going to do at the next meeting. But my guess is that they're going to do not nearly as much as people were thinking. That they're smart people. They're aware of this, and they do feel that they have some credibility to rescue because they understated inflation, and that will probably cause them to go a bit too far. But I think that if we get another good CPI report, then there's going to be a lot of soul searching at the Fed, saying, are we really being way too hawkish? And let's not forget also that there aren't just lags in the true state of the economy being reflected in inflation. There's also big lags in the effect of Fed policy on the economy. And we haven't remotely seen, with the economy has stayed surprisingly strong, but there's a lot that hasn't happened yet as a result of the interest hikes that have already been conducted. So I think that the Fed is probably, when people are talking about 500 basis point terminal Fed funds rate, I mean, it's not crazy, but it really doesn't look likely given what we're seeing.
Okay, it's always such a pleasure and really beneficial to talk with you, Professor. That is Paul Krugman. He's professor at the City University of New York. Coming up, we're going to talk with former Homeland Security Secretary Jeh Johnson about what we learned from the midterm elections. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, we are still trying to figure out what happened in those midterm elections. We have a lot of results, but frankly, quite a few important ones we don't have yet. Although I think it's fair to say it's coming out in a different way than what many of us in the media might have predicted. To take us through what he has seen, what he thinks we've learned from these midterm elections, welcome now Jeh Johnson. He's partner at Paul Weiss. Mr. Johnson served as Secretary of Homeland Security under President Obama and as General Counsel of the Department of Defense. So, Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for joining us. I know you don't really come from a political background. You're more on the national security front. But what do you think we as a country learned about ourselves during these midterm elections?
First of all, David, thanks for having me. I always enjoy being on your show. You're right. I am not a political pundit, but I am a student of history. David, if you look back over midterm elections of the last 40 years, going back to 1982, if history is a guide, Tuesday should have been a blowout for Republicans. Typically, the party in the White House loses seats in Congress in the midterm elections. The most notable example of that was 1994, Bill Clinton's first term, where Republicans picked up 54 seats, and 2010, Barack Obama's first term, where Republicans picked up 63 seats, which was by President Obama's own account, a shellacking. I served in his administration at the time. This result is very much going to be a draw. It looks like the Republicans may have a slight majority in the House. We may have a 50-50 Senate all over again, depending upon the results in Georgia, Nevada, and Arizona. It may be 51-49 Republican, but it's very much a draw. My interpretation of this result at a national level is that the American public is growing tired of what I'll refer to as Trumpism. And it is my hope that the Republican establishment will look at this result, will look at how far short they fell in terms of this result, and conclude that, hey, maybe this having Donald Trump as the leader of our party is not working so well for us, and we'll begin to move on.
Jay, whether it was 2020 or before that, perhaps tied a bit with former President Trump, is questioning of the process itself, whether the elections are legitimate. As we know, we had that awful situation on January 6th with the attacking on the Capitol. That was very much on the ballot. We heard President Biden say that. We had President Obama say that was very much on the ballot. How'd democracy do in this ballot, as in retrospect?
I think democracy did well on Tuesday. First of all, voter participation is on the rise in America. Whether it's the presidential elections every 4 years or the midterms every 4 years, voter participation has been going up dramatically. And the incidents of election fraud, ballot mischief are so infinitesimal, so small that nearest round percentage number is zero. And that's really a testament to how far we've come. One of the things I did, David, just before I left office in January 2017 was to declare election infrastructure to be critical infrastructure in our country. And in the face of COVID and the challenges of COVID over the last 2-3 years, I think our election officials, our election infrastructure has done remarkably well with these increasing numbers of voters in America.
So that seems to be doing better. Talk about political violence. You and I have talked before about the threats of domestic terrorism, certainly international, but domestic terrorism. Now we have this horrible incident with the husband of the Speaker of the House. Is this something on the rise? How concerned should we be about it? What can we do about it?
We should be concerned about it. It is something that is on the rise. You know, I look back to the 1960s. In a 5-year period, David, we lost Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and John and Robert Kennedy in a 5-year period. It is, in some respects, remarkable that no one's been killed in modern day, given the rhetoric, given the environment, which, in my observation, is at least as combustible as the 1960s. I've believed for a long time, David, that words have consequences, that people really do listen to their leaders. And if our leaders make unacceptable rhetoric acceptable, the rest will follow. And for the deranged among us, violence inevitable. And so it really must be the responsibility of leaders on both sides of the aisle to tamp the rhetoric down, be more responsible. And my hope is that our political leadership will look at this result from 3 days ago, and conclude that that's what the American public really does want of them.
And finally, Jay, I'm mindful of the fact that it is the 11th of November, which, of course, is Veterans Day in the United States of America, when we remember what our veterans have done for us. You served, as I say, among other things, as General Counsel of the Department of Defense. You know these people. You've worked with them very closely. Give us your thoughts about what we should be thinking about on this Veterans Day, and, by the way, what maybe we should be doing about our veterans right now.
We should honor our veterans. We should honor those who were willing to put on the uniform and serve on behalf of all the rest of us. David, my father was in the Army during the Korean War. I have 2 uncles who were Tuskegee Airmen in World War II. I have ancestors who were in World War I, the Civil War, and even the American Revolutionary War. But my thoughts today go to a retired Army colonel named Chris Kalenda, who was an Afghanistan combat veteran. He led a unit in Afghanistan. And Chris, leading up to this Memorial Day, this Veterans Day, decided to embark on a 1,600-mile bike ride to every single cemetery where somebody is buried who died under his command, which was a remarkable feat for someone who's not a normal bicycle rider. But it's that kind of heroism and fortitude that I hope the American public salutes today.
Yeah, true devotion to your comrades. It's really something to inspire all of us. Thank you so much, Jay. Always love having you with us. That's Jay Johnson. He's a partner of Paul Weiss and former Secretary of Homeland Security under President Obama. Still to come, we're going to talk with former Democratic Senator from Louisiana, Mary Landrieu, about the midterms and the direction of the Democratic Party. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio.
Season is here.
The earnings are starting to pour in.
The numbers are holding up better than expected.
Sorry, business isn't all that bad.
Bloomberg breaks the numbers first.
Netflix earnings going to cross the wire.
A big beat. Stock is up more than 8%. Coming in stronger than their rivals.
With exclusive expert analysis.
Finally back to growth.
The mother of all opportunities.
What is the industry to watch? That's where the rubber hits the road for Goldman Sachs.
It's going to be a really interesting earnings season.
Bloomberg Television and Radio. The fastest numbers and analysis you trust.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We're into day 2 after those CPI numbers, and although it isn't quite like day 1, it is still nonetheless vaguely positive. And to take us through it, here's Kriti Gupta. So what's going on?
Well, you know, David, it's interesting. In the last 10 months or so, one of the
I want to say, Achilles heels of the markets has, of course, been the tech sector. This idea that if rates continue to go higher, the dollar continues to get stronger, why would you invest in some of these mega cap tech stocks? In the last, I want to say, 48 hours, the dynamic has really changed here, where you are starting to see some of these tech bulls kind of emerge out of the woodwork. It's interesting today that even with some of the crypto news coming out of FTX, you did see that initial slide in the NASDAQ, just kind of think contagion, think sentiment, only for it to flip around. The S&P 500 now up about 0.3%, but the NASDAQ really outperforming big, up over 1%. Of course, we know the bond market is closed, so that's probably adding some fuel to that rally. But nevertheless, you are starting to see the NASDAQ really add some value. In fact, $1 trillion added in value, and really leading, by the way, the rally coming off of that inflation data. I think that's pretty significant, because just given that some of these big cap tech names make, I think, 26% of the S&P 500, you really can't have a sustainable bull rally without actually having tech on your side. And it starts to feel like the early signs that that is actually happening.
So, Kriti, one of the things I'm fascinated by is everybody keeps saying there's so much volatility. It's so volatile. It's going to even be more volatile.
Sure.
And yet, if I look at the VIX right now, we're down like a 22.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because it's interesting. When people talk about the volatility, it kind of feels like they're referring more to the bond market that kind of has these ripple effects. But to your point, the volatility on the stock market is actually fairly muted. And it's because we've been going in one direction nonstop. And when you have that kind of slide, it means that there's no swing. Think about what you saw in March or April of 2020, this idea of you were in the green by 5-6% one day, in the red the next day by the same margin. You're not quite seeing that, even on the heels of a 5.3% rally yesterday, the biggest since April of 2020. Day two, the S&P 500 is only up 0.3%. To me, you want that lower volatility to signal a little bit more healthiness.
So one thing that was on the march for the longest time was the dollar. I mean, it got up close to record levels, as I understand it. Where is it now?
Well, the dynamic is really changing on the dollar. And if you'll remember, going into the midterms, you had this 3-day slide on the dollar. And the narrative around that was simply that this was the conversation about the debt ceiling, the idea that a gridlock in Congress would bring the debt ceiling back into focus by Republicans, and that in itself would affect the fundamentals of the United States and therefore weigh on the dollar and create kind of a bear case for it. Post-CPI, that bear case has widened and accelerated. The idea here being that interest rate differentials, the idea of the Fed just hiking by these massive margins, that's all going to slow down, if not next month, and certainly in 2023. And what that does is say that the dollar strength that you've been seeing year to date, it's been pricing in everything from the Federal Reserve. It's priced in the strength of the U.S. economy.
And now it's pricing in the debt ceiling, potentially.
Right.
Thank you so much to Kriti Gupta. You can catch Kriti again at 1 p.m. Eastern Time as she anchors Bloomberg Markets. Coming up, with key midterm races still undecided, we'll talk with former Louisiana Senator Mary Landrieu about where her Democratic Party is headed. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We want to keep you up to date with news from all around the world. For that, we turn to Lisa Mateo here with the first word.
Thank you, David. Well, it's a dramatic setback for Vladimir Putin and Russia's war against Ukraine. Ukrainian troops have now entered the regional city of Kherson after Russian forces withdrew. Kherson was part of the territory that Putin illegally annexed in September. He said then it would remain Russian forever. President Biden maintains the U.S. has an unwavering commitment to fight climate change. In his speech at the UN Climate Conference in Egypt, he said the U.S. is on track to meet its Paris Agreement goals.
And the sum total of the actions my administration is taking puts the United States on track to achieve our Paris Agreement goal of reducing emissions 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030.
Still, there's concern that Republican gains in Congress could impact attempts to provide $11.4 billion in international climate finance. The British economy shrank in the third quarter, marking the start of what's expected to be a protracted recession. Gross domestic product fell 0.2%. Consumer spending and business investment both fell during the quarter. The Bank of England sees a recession persisting into the middle of 2024. And it's a stunning downfall for Sam Bankman-Fried. His FTX crypto exchange empire has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. As part of the filings, Bankman-Fried resigned as CEO. FTX faced a liquidity crisis this month after prices for the exchange's native token FTT plunged and users raced to withdraw their assets. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Lisa Mateo. This is Bloomberg. David.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Great to have you with us. Well, many of us spent a lot of the week focused on the midterm elections, what was going to happen, and now we're trying to figure out what did happen, in fact, because although it wasn't quite what a lot of people thought, we don't really have all the answers, including which party is going to control both the House and the Senate. To help us understand what we saw and perhaps speculate a bit about where we're going next, we welcome now Mary Landrieu. She's former Democratic senator from Louisiana. Ms. Landrieu is now a member of the Leadership Council of Natural Allies for a Clean Energy Future, which focuses on natural gas. So, Senator, thank you so much for being with us. First of all, what do we know, what don't we know about what came out of these elections?
Well, David, it sure looks like the voters were earnestly searching for the sensible center. The House is barely Republican, although it hasn't been officially called yet. The Senate looks like it's going to stay 50-50 with Democrats, in charge. Georgia has yet to be decided, and there are two other states outstanding. But everywhere you look in House races, governor's races, where states went a little too far to the right, voters pushed them back to the center or a little left. If states went too far to the left, they pushed them back a little to the right. I think our voters want us to focus on moving this economy forward, an energy policy that makes sense, that meets our climate objectives, but that creates really good jobs here in America and keeps us strong abroad. I mean, there were some really important messages that voters sent, and I think Democrats and Republicans would be wise to really look to the center for solutions moving forward.
As you say, Senator, that's true for Democrats and Republicans, but you know Democrats particularly well. You come from a family of Democrats, last time I checked. What message would you like the Democratic Party to take away? Because there are some who've speculated that at times things went a little bit left when it comes to the Congress.
Yes, well, I think one of the areas where Democrats, could be more authentic and embracing is meeting our climate goals by understanding the importance of natural gas supporting renewables. Yes, this country needs to move forward on wind and solar. We have Republicans that are championing wind and solar. Texas, a Republican state, has more wind resources than any state in America. Many people don't know that. But we need to back it up with a fuel that we can count on, a power source, and that's natural gas. It's abundant, it's cheap, and it can be cleaner. That's another thing that I think Democrats might misread, is the industry itself is supporting methane reductions. The industry itself wants to be the cleanest natural gas in the world, and we already are and can be. And I also think that Republicans need to take a look at these younger voters who turned out en masse. These younger voters believe in liberty and freedom, individual choices on reproductive, choice and rights. Gun safety, I think, is an issue. But younger voters, conservatives and, from the polling I've seen, and more liberal-leaning young voters are very focused on a clean energy future. And they're serious about climate objectives. So there's a lot to work with here. I'm actually encouraged, of course, as a Democrat. I would love to have seen the House stay and of course, the Senate. But, having the House barely Republican gives the center in both parties an opportunity to work with President Biden on a common sense path forward.
And what about leadership in the party? First of all, start with the Congress. Is it time for there to be some new membership in some of the leadership? Which is not to say anything bad about the old leadership, but there comes a time for all of us to step aside.
Absolutely. Look, I'm 67. I might even not should be on this program, but you get people that are in their 70s and 80s, and not that you can't be effective, but there's so many young, wonderful leaders in our country, and I think you're going to see a new crop. I mean, Nancy Pelosi's done an amazing job as Speaker, and of course Steny Hoyer and James Clyburn. I mean, for me, you couldn't ask for a better group of leaders that represent broadly the country. But I think they would even say it's time for the next generation to step up. And, you know, and on the Republican side, I would only say that, you know, the Trump wing of the party took a pretty big hit yesterday. And these climate deniers and election deniers don't look real great in the light of the morning after the election or the week after the election. So I think the leadership of the Republican Party has to do some soul searching about its future. And I think you're going to see that happen.
Well, by the way, Senator, if you're 67 and maybe you should think about the program, you got at least 3 more years than I do because I'm 70. So that maybe say something about what I should be doing with my time. Well,
then maybe we could stay a little bit longer. But, you know, at a point, you know, it's like the older generation has to step aside. There are many amazing, wonderful leaders.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Couldn't agree more. We boomers have a tendency not to get off the page. But let me push you just a little bit. We have President Biden in the office. He says he's going to think about this, maybe over the holidays, come up early next year, decide whether he's going to run or not. Whatever he decides, what's the bench? By the way, does the bench have a Landro on it?
Well, it might. You know, my brother Mitch has been talked about in any number of interviews and commentary, and he's truly just an amazingly talented man. There are also many others, some of whom have run before, some of whom are looking. So we'll see. But President Biden has really delivered, honestly. He has really delivered on his promises to address climate, the economy, helping us get through COVID. But I want to get back to energy just for a moment, because I really want the American public to know America has met its climate goals faster than Europe and better than Europe, despite what people might see and hear, because we have used our natural gas to displace coal. And foreign coal, the coal plants in China and India and in other places, which is their natural resource, their easiest resource, is really the culprit. Even if America went completely green tomorrow, we're not going to meet the global climate goals. Only natural gas supporting renewables and nuclear, I might say. I mean, nuclear is very important. Both our traditional large nuclear plants, which we have 100 of the 400 in the world. We have 100 here in America. We need to keep them going, not like Germany, who closed theirs down, and now they're in trouble. So we can do this. I'm excited about the jobs that can be created here, so thanks.
By the way, we just had former governor of New Jersey, Christine Todd Whitman, on, and she was talking about nuclear as well, that you just can't get to really zero emissions without nuclear. Thank you so much, Senator.
We should listen to Christy Todd Whitman. Believe me, she's a Republican we should listen to. Thanks so much.
There you go. Thank you so much, Senator. Great to have you with us. It's Mary Landrieu. She's former Democratic Senator from Louisiana and member of the Leadership Council of the Natural Allies for a Clean Energy Future. Coming up, we may not know all the results yet, but the midterm elections have already triggered struggles within the Republican Party. We're going to go through what we can expect with our political contributor, Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, we keep waiting for the results on some Senate races and some House races to know exactly which party is in majority in either or both houses. At the same time, there is some fallout already. We're looking toward a leadership contest next Tuesday among Republicans in the House. And we have President Trump, former President Trump, going to make a big announcement. And there's a lot surrounding that. To take us through it, we welcome now back our Bloomberg politics contributor. He is Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital. Rick, it feels like I've spent all week with you, which has been to my benefit. It's really good of you to show up one more time.
Interesting election.
So take us through what's going on here. On Tuesday, it seems like it's going to be a pretty interesting day in the history of the Republican Party. By the way, I think Mike Pence is going to have a book out that day, too.
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously everybody's lining up. It's post-election. Even though we're still counting and we don't even know who's in control, everybody's already looking for 2024. And so Donald Trump teased out that he's going to announce his presidential campaign. We have no reason to not believe that that's exactly what he's going to do. And we do know that a lot of people are trying to talk him out of it, but he doesn't usually take advice from anybody. And I don't think it's a surprise, as you point out, David, that his former vice president, Mike Pence, has got a book coming out. So help me God. That's a grabber of a title. And he's going to be on a book tour. So he's not the only one. I mean, Ron DeSantis, Glenn Youngkin, there are a lot of stars in the party right now who are looking to try and get out of the shadow of Donald Trump.
Yeah, and Donald Trump doesn't seem to like them very much around him. And when you talk about Ron DeSantis, so oh my God, sounds like a Ron DeSantis political ad to me.
Look, I mean, the guy has a pretty stellar election day. I mean, at a time when a lot of Republicans kind of failed to deliver the goods, he exceeded expectations. And so you have to give him his due. And very much so, the media is embracing him as the future of the Republican Party. I mean, when Rupert Murdoch puts his golden hand on his shoulder and said, this is the future, the reality is we got to pay attention.
Well, I was going to go exactly there because, as you imagine, here in New York, the talk of the town is actually what's going on with Murdoch and Trump and DeSantis. Because, as you know, there was a Wall Street Journal editorial yesterday, which was very harsh. And there also is that cover of the New York Post showing the former president of the United States as Humpty Dumpty.
Humpty Trumpty, Trumpty Dumpty. I mean, I think is what it was. Yeah. I mean, look, these are all outlets owned and operated by Rupert Murdoch and his message machine. Not to mention Fox News, which has really actually been more critical of Trump than it's ever before. The Wall Street Journal, though, made a real case. It said, we lost seats in 18, in 20, in 22, and in 21. As Donald Trump was our standard bearer in the party, we can't let this happen any further. And it's been a political fiasco. So when the Wall Street Journal says that about the former president, it is definitely a punch in the face by Rupert Murdoch.
Well, and it's good fun for us to watch. It's sort of amusing or something. But at the same time, Rupert Murdoch has a history of picking political winners in this country and also in the United Kingdom. So perhaps Donald Trump has to take it a little bit seriously if Rupert Murdoch's not picking him.
That's right, David. I mean, not only is he good at picking winners and elevating them with the communications capacity that he has, but he's also good at picking people he doesn't like. And heaven forbid that you're ever on that list, because right now Donald Trump is, and you've seen the headlines you just described. I don't know how anybody can withstand a negative assault by Rupert Murdoch.
Wow. Well, that's pretty important. Thank you so much, Rick. It's really been such a pleasure working with you all week long. That is Rick Davis. He's a partner at Stone Court Capital, and I'm delighted to say Bloomberg political contributor. Coming up, we're going to examine the role of minority votes in this week's midterms with Professor Andra Gillespie of Emory University. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David West, and we're going to wrap up this hour talking once again about the midterms, but a particular aspect of midterms, what we know about minority voters, people of color showing up, and what they might have indicated about what the issues are. We welcome now Andra Gillespie. She's professor of political science at Emory University and author of the book Race and the Obama Administration, out from Oxford University Press. Professor, thank you so much for being with us. What do we know at this point about people of color and the extent to which they showed up to vote?
So turnout levels are at about where we would have expected them to be, given numbers in the population and also based on citizenship status. There, is still room for improvement amongst all groups. But, in particular for African Americans, they're starting to approach their numbers in the population. We still historically have seen lower levels of voter turnout amongst Latino and Asian American voters. But based on the exit poll data, it looks like the number of Latinos who are showing up to vote proportionally is at pace with where African Americans are in the population. It still has room to grow, obviously, given the fact that that's a larger group. And then Asian Americans made up 2% of voters who actually turned out on Tuesday. So there's still some room for growth there. That fits kind of historical trends where we know that white and black voters tend to turn out at higher rates than Asian American and Latino voters.
And Professor, do we know much about whether they voted for Democrats or Republicans? Leading into this election, there was a lot of talk about Hispanic voters, particularly perhaps moving a bit away from the Republican Party, from the Democratic Party toward the Republican Party.
Yeah, so if we look at the votes are about where we would expect them to be for African American voters. So the exit polls indicate that about 88% of Black voters voted for Democratic candidates in their respective districts. And so the target is usually about 90% based on historic trends. And I always say 90%, give or take a couple of points. So that's within range and expected. We do see some differences amongst Asian American and Latino voters. Those have always been the case. So those groups have broken Democratic historically, but they haven't been as overwhelmingly Democratic as their African American counterparts are. And so if we look at Asian American and Latino voters, the break is lower. So you are going to get somewhere in the neighborhood of about 40% of those voters voting Republican. It's been lower in other elections, but this is actually also on kind of like the high boundary of historically where we've seen this before. So I think what we need to get used to is the idea that it is not an apples to apples comparison when we try to use the same tools and the same history to explain why Asian American and Latino voters vote Democratic versus African Americans. There are different groups who've had different experiences, and their historic patterns of voting for Democratic and Republican candidates vary. And so this isn't what I would say is outside of the realm of possibility. I just think people are applying the African American standard to Asian American and Latino voters.
I also wonder if it's even trickier for you because, for example, as you'd imagine, not all Hispanic voters are created equal. I mean, there's talk about South Florida and a move there, which may be different from Southern Texas, because we did see that the Democrats held 2 of the 3 House seats that were thought might go the other way.
So, I mean, I think it's important to think as we're looking at the national picture to understand that, yes, while it is historically true that Cuban Americans, for instance, are the most Republican voting bloc amongst the larger Latino subgroups, that when we're talking about this overall trend of there being Latino Republicans, that actually does include people who aren't Cuban, who aren't Venezuelan. So there are conservative Latino Republicans who could be Mexican American or Puerto Rican. And one of the things that's actually really interesting about the vote spread in the group was that there appear to be generational differences with older Latinos breaking Republican in this election and their children and grandchildren perhaps being the ones who were voting more Democratic.
So one of the challenges we all have right now is we don't really know the results in some key races. And let's pick on one right in your state of Georgia, because we have a runoff coming December 6th. And that's between 2 black candidates, actually, which is interesting. What do we know about people of color, how they're likely to vote in the runoff?
So I would expect that this is about turnout. This really isn't about persuasion at this point. And so I would expect that the demographic profile of a Herschel Walker voter in December is not going to differ tremendously from what the demographic of a Herschel Walker voter would have been in November. So in general, 90% of African-American voters voted for Raphael Warnock. And it was about roughly a 60-40 split, give or take a couple points for Asian American and Latino voters in Georgia. And I don't expect that this is going to change. I think the issue is making sure that all of those voters turn back out to vote. I think the one thing that was actually really interesting about this from an African-American standpoint was the idea that despite the fact that there were 2 black candidates, that voters overwhelmingly chose the Democratic candidate. Given the fact that most blacks are Democrats, that in and of itself is not surprising. But Herschel Walker actually got fewer black votes than Brian Kemp or Brad Raffensperger in the Secretary of State race. And I think that has to do with perceptions of candidate quality and perhaps the suspicion among some black voters that Donald Trump boosted Walker's candidacy in an attempt to try to match racially his opponent, but also being done kind of in a spirit of tokenism. And they actually put forward a candidate that wouldn't have been as strong as, say, some of the other candidates who were running for the Republican nomination, including black Republicans, because there were 2, one of which could have been perceived as a really credible candidate.
You know, one of the things I've always observed at television is if the audience thinks you're being cynical with them, it doesn't work so well. That suggests that maybe some black voters thought, wait a second, don't try to manipulate me.
Yeah, I mean, and I think most of those voters were probably already predisposed to vote Democratic, but I think that they had questions about whether or not Herschel Walker was the best representative to represent Georgia and whether or not he actually represented the best that the Republican Party could offer them in a black candidate.
Yeah, it's fascinating. This has been very, very informative. Really appreciate you being with us. That's Professor Andra Gillespie of Emory University and author, once again, of Race and the Obama Administration. You want to read that book. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and also online. Coming up, Balance of Power is going to continue on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we'll get a preview of the G20 meetings from Karl Kupchan of the Council on Foreign Relations. As we know, there's going to be a meeting on Tuesday of next week between President Xi and President Biden. A lot of eyes on that meeting. Low expectations, but a lot of potential as these 2 leaders meet and try to talk about some of the issues, red lines between them. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.